I guess we should start. Yeah. My name is Paolo Carloni. I'm very happy to chair this morning session. I've been a PhD student of Michele some couple of years ago. A couple. And there's so many things have been said about Michele. For me, it's been life-changing. I would like just to tell one episode that was right the first second, so we met. So I told Michele, I'm here, I would like to learn your method, and of course I'll do silicon, I think you're doing. I'm a biophysicist, so I said, okay. And then Michele said, there are so many people doing solid-state physics here, why don't you show me your protein? After a couple of minutes, I showed the protein, and Michele started to tell me things about this protein. I've been working on my PhD for a couple of years that I didn't think about it. I said, this is a good end of my PhD. That was something really remarkable. And I still enjoy very much learning from his method and collaborating with him to this date. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Mike Klein from Temple Universities, who's going to talk about Signal Cray, and we look for your talk.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. A pleasure to be here. I'm going to give a talk about the early days of computing. I came to create this talk because I have among my group of friends a lot of business people, self-made people, and asked me to actually give a talk. And so I put together a lot of slides. I've shuffled it down to about half the number I would normally use and try and see if I can keep it to half an hour. So the story begins in the 1930s, and a young man called Turing went to Cambridge to study mathematics, and he was a bright student. He finished in usual time, and he managed to get a scholarship to stay on and do research, which is pretty common in Cambridge. He stayed on at his own college, King's College. As I said, became a fellow. And then while he was in that intermediate position, he was a graduate, but not a graduate student. He took a course on logic taught by a mathematician called Max Neumann. Max Neumann was a refugee from Nazi Germany whose name was originally Neumann. He anglicized it. He was a rather brilliant logician, mathematician. And Turing was inspired by those lectures to think about a computing machine. And he went away and he wrote a paper which he went back and showed to Max Neumann. And unbeknown to him, Max Neumann was a serious mathematician, well-positioned. He was a fellow of the Royal Society. He was well-positioned with the British Mathematical Society, but he was also connected to Alonzo Church, who was a logician at Princeton, who had just created the Journal of Symbolic Logic. He was, in fact, the founding editor and had published papers on the same subject as Turing. Turing hadn't realized that he'd been scooped by Alonzo Church. And there's a beautiful comment I've highlighted in blue there, where Alonzo Church had sent a paper to Max Neumann, the same field, and Neumann had just received the paper from Turing. And then he says here, an off-print which you kindly sent me recently, in which you define calculable numbers and show that the decision problem is insoluble, had a rather painful effect on a young man, Alan Turing, who had just about to send in a paper for publication in which he had defined computable numbers for the same purpose. And so if you see here at the bottom, I've highlighted that Turing shows that they are equivalent and adds that to his paper. So what I find even more fascinating is that Turing then decides to go and do a PhD with Alonzo Church at Princeton, which of course I think his fellowship enabled him to do that. He could go in the true Cambridge tradition, right? He could go where he wants, do what he wants. And, but that paper eventually came out, and you might be amused to know that there is an addendum to that paper, which most people don't cite when they cite the work, but I thought you might want to see what was wrong with the paper. So this is what was wrong with the paper. So those of you who are not mathematicians, I shouldn't worry about it, but the errors were pointed out by this guy, Bernays, a very eminent mathematician, Swiss mathematician. So while he was at Princeton, Turing came into contact with von Neumann, and von Neumann was keen for Turing to stay and be in the von Neumann circuit at the Institute of Advanced Studies. But Turing decided he wanted to go back to UK. So he went back to King's College. That was 1938. Already 1939, the Second World War started, and Turing was assigned to Bletchley. This was not a random event. So many of the popular movies and plays and whatever have somehow melded, in my mind, Newman with Turing as one individual. In fact, Newman was much more important than Turing, in my view, reading these ancient documents. So it was Newman that brought Turing to Bletchley. Now, there's another factoid that I wasn't aware of when I was putting together this talk. It turns out that after the First World War, the French and the Poles were very suspicious of the Germans, and so they had a whole operation of mathematicians trying to decode the encrypted messages the German military were using. That was all, it's never mentioned where I grew up in England, but it turns out that this mathematician there that's honored now, all this, once Poland was invaded, then the Poles shared this with the Brits at Bletchley. So what was going on at Bletchley was not from the ground up. They already had a good start, and I'm not going to belabor that anymore. They were very successful. Now, it turns out one of the very first computers was in fact built by the British, called Colossus. And they made about a dozen of them during the Second World War. And the most important, does it work? The most important thing about, no, not working. It doesn't matter. Okay, let me go on. So the second individual I want to highlight is this young man, Claude Shannon. He was born in rural Michigan. He went to the University of Michigan when he was 16 years old. An ambitious young kid decided to do 2 degrees. He did mathematics and electrical engineering, and he finished in time, in 4 years. So when he was the age of typical high school graduate, he went to MIT to do his master's. Shannon was one of these nerdy geniuses, and he did do his PhD and master's degree at MIT, and I'll say a bit more about him. So Shannon is most famous for a publication he made in 1948. A lot of the work he did between when he joined Bell Labs and this 48 paper was classified. So it never got published till after the war. And he is the father of information theory, and this mathematical theory of communication. This one in the bottom. Oh, thank you, thank you. This mathematical theory here, when I looked to make this slide, there were 188,000 citations. So the only paper I know with more citations than that is PBE, with John Perdue, which is, I think, 220,000. But anyway, as I said, a lot of what Shannon did was secret, and I've highlighted there in the yellow part there. His theory is really how we communicate today. So let's go on. So what did he do for his master's thesis? He wrote the theory of how you lay down an electrical circuit. And I mean, you can read it faster than I can. So he developed a calculus for solving the equations for laying down a circuit, and he says the calculus is exactly analogous to the calculus of propositions used in symbolic logic. So people say this is the greatest master's thesis that's ever written, and I went to the MIT website, and you can download it, and so the total number of downloads of this thesis exceeds 100,000. So, I was just curious, so I did download it, and there was immediately one very puzzling item. So they have redacted his signature on this one, but not his PhD thesis. I don't understand why. But the interesting thing here is the date is 1937 August, but when you look here, it's 1940. And then you look here, oh, this is when he's undergraduate, but when you look here, it was put in the library August 1940. Here's December 1940. So maybe he didn't pay the fee you were necessary to get your master's degree. Maybe he didn't actually file it, but he, being a typical nerdy guy, I don't think he cares one way or the other. But then I discovered that he got married in January 1940. So maybe the fact that he got married encouraged him to file for his master's degree and PhD. There's another possible interpretation, is he got a scholarship to go spend a year at the Institute of Advanced Studies, and maybe they wanted some proof that he actually had his degrees. If any of you don't know the story of Shannon, I encourage you to go look at this movie. It's about an hour and a half long. You can find it on YouTube. It is an incredible, it's an homage to him, written to celebrate the 100 years of his birth. It's a rather beautifully done movie. Well, he was an eccentric character at Bell Labs. He was known to work with his office door shut and not communicate with anybody. But if he went from A to B, he rode a unicycle along the corridor, juggling at the same time, different objects. So he was, but he solved the problem. If you want to take data from A to B in the presence of noise, he solved that problem, and that enables us all to communicate with our cell phones and other things. Not surprising he worried about that, because he was at Bell Labs, right, the telephone company. So he's most famous for some of these things that came out after that in publication. This one, for example, entropy of printed English, where a different letter is associated with it in entropy, the so-called Shannon entropy, so, which comes up now in the kinds of things many of us do. And then there are other papers, for instance, this one that was secret until 1949, the theory of secret systems and so on. So very, very nerdy, deep guy, worked on his own, didn't obviously collaborate. So fast forward 10 years, Second World War, Turing, when he got back, he was at Bletchley. And the British sent him to the United States because, remember, he had a PhD from Princeton, so he knew people. They sent him to spend 6 months traveling around to find out what the Americans were doing, because the Americans entered the war in 1942, but the war had started in 1939. So he was kind of a spy. And they told him to take nothing that can identify him as working on secret classified things. The man didn't take anything to identify himself and shows up at US immigration with no identification. So I don't know the story of how he managed to enter, but that's not written in the books. But anyway, he did spend 2 of the 6 months at Bell Labs, and rumor says every day he had tea with Shannon. It would have been wonderful to be the fly on the wall. What did these 2 nerds talk about? And there's a clue in the next slide that I'm going to show here. This is the fast forward 10 years, and Shannon was trying to put together a collection of articles on automata, and he wrote to Shannon wrote to Turing and said, can you contribute an article? And the wonders of the web, I was able to download the reply from Turing. And he says, thank you very much. Unfortunately, I'm not working in that field anymore. I'm working on mathematics and morphogenesis. Okay, and then he says, well, maybe you'll be interested in that, so I'll send you a copy of what I'm doing. But it shows the respect, because when that volume came out, Shannon actually wrote a chapter on the Turing machine. So it shows the mutual respect. I thought that was an interesting factoid to share. Of course, Turing committed suicide 1 year after that letter was written. Okay, Shannon became a celebrity because he constructed a mouse that could learn its way out of a maze. And the Bell Labs people made a movie of this, and he became a significant figure, although he hated this, right? He wanted to be left alone. But Vogue magazine had a cover of Audrey Hepburn, and inside there's an article, "The man machines may first talk to Dr. Shannon." So he was a bit of a celebrity. So the photographs we have of him really date from that Vogue interview. Okay, so what about computers? I don't have time to talk about all these computers, but several places were simultaneously working on computers for various reasons. Most of them were electromechanical. Some of them had valves. All this is before transistor. I could talk about all these. I don't have the time. I'm just going to focus on ENIAC that was built at the University of Pennsylvania. So it was commissioned by the military, and rumor says that it was used in part to help the design of the implosion device. The same story holds true for the machine that was built at Harvard by the Navy. Don't know if it's true. So this machine was built over a 3-year period by 2 engineers, Presper Eckert and John Mauchly. And the machine was, in fact, delivered to the military. This machine was designed to calculate trajectories of shells fired out of a cannon, basically. There's famous stories of there were no male mathematicians to hire, so they hired half a dozen female mathematicians. And when I read the obituary of Kay McNulty, she was the one that said, my working title was computer. So the first computer was a woman. Now, when I showed that slide in India, I got into deep trouble because they told me that when the Brits did the triangulation survey of India, the chief surveyor was called a computer. And he did such a great job, he was promoted, but he wasn't called supercomputer. But anyway, this is the first. So the people that used the machines and calculators were called computers. This machine was a giant thing. It weighed 30 tons, 5 million hand-soldered pieces, not very practical, and it couldn't be programmed other than by rewiring it. And so these women computers literally had to wire a solution to a problem. So they were the programmers. So this is the first machine. So obviously the engineers that built that were interested in doing something a bit better. And von Neumann, who was into everything that was going on, he was the dominant mathematician around, the alpha male. He snooped around and ingratiated himself to these characters because he had an idea it would be much better if instead of doing all this rewiring, it could be done inside the machine. It seems, with my researchers, it's not clear to me whether Eckart and Mauchly already knew that themselves or whether von Neumann really brought that to the table. But in any case, von Neumann went and wrote a draft report of the next machine to be built and carefully distributed it without putting the names of Eckart and Mauchly, which, the way I look at it, seems to me scandalous these days. He would never have got away with it. But I guess he was such a powerful individual that he did. And by the way, he was a consultant to IBM, and so IBM knew everything that was going on. And so I'm not sure everything he did was honorable. Anyway, his report was widely distributed, but he also gave lectures on high-speed computing. And he was one to say, according to what I found, I've given a citation, von Neumann said, Turing's machine was simple and neat, but it didn't tell me how to build a computer. Which is true, of course. However, it didn't stop von Neumann going around lecturing on Turing machines. Wonders of the web these days, I was able to download his lectures from 1945, lecture 3, The Logical Machine of Turing. So, that's a bit of history. So, what happened next was an explosion of interest in building machines. Eckart and Macaulay filed a patent for their machine. University of Pennsylvania wanted them to sign over all the royalties to the university. They refused. They both resigned their position, and they made their own company. And that company was the, is it on there somewhere? It was called the Electronic Computer Company or something like that. And then it also changed again. So remember that this second generation machine was already conceived and widely distributed. And they managed, Eckart and Macaulay managed to sell it to the ballistics lab, and a version was built and delivered in 1949. Now, Turing, after the war, was recruited and hired at the National Physical Laboratory, where he was put in charge of designing a computer, which he did, of a similar type. But they decided it was too complicated to build, and they just built a prototype. And this was actually marketed at some point. A second copy of the EDVAC was built and assembled, working in 1952. Here, canonical people here you'll recognize. So von Neumann was sufficiently influential and powerful that he got the second version of that machine in Princeton. Now, Turing, when he left National Physical Laboratory, Max Newman, who was his professor back at Cambridge, was in charge of this project at the University of Manchester. Newman left Cambridge and went to the University of Manchester and was connected with the development of the first machine here built in the UK. And he brought Turing to Manchester. That's how he got there. And it says here he wrote a programming manual for this first machine. So this was a machine that was then commercialized in the UK that came out about the same time. So there was a lot going on. Now, also in the US, this is a very important development. All the branches of the army had code breaking going on, and they needed computers. And the Navy didn't want to lose this, so it did a startup, Engineering Research Associates, and Engineering Research Associates built computers. And this is, in fact, where UNIVAC came from. And they built machines and delivered them as well. And they got to a point where the Congress or politicians didn't like the fact that the Navy had its own company to build it computers, so they had to divest themselves of that. So that led to some changes. So Engineering Research Associates was actually where Seymour Cray started his life. I've got it here. He fought in the Second World War. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge to get into Germany, and then he was transferred to the Pacific to do code breaking. And then he went, after the war, he went to university. He studied electrical engineering. He graduated, and then he took a master's in mathematics. And while he was doing his master's in mathematics, he joined ERA and was associated with the design and building of the UNIVAC 1103. And here's a picture of UNIVAC 1103. So he was very much involved in that. So here's the story of UNIVAC, but there's an interesting story about this, which I'll jump ahead to. So these first computers were built in Philadelphia, and I only discovered that printing this. And you can go and see, the building is still there. They were actually built in Philadelphia. I never knew that. As I said, Cray comes into the picture here with the UNIVAC, and this year is the 100th anniversary of his birth, and it's actually the 50th anniversary of him announcing the Cray 1. So let me go through that. So that's here. So he joined the ERA. Just to say a little bit more about UNIVAC, because it was actually sold to do the US Census, the first one, which is significant, 1951. It was a real machine, it worked, and it went through various editions. And the 1108 was a machine I used in the early 70s at the University of Paris, working with Jean-Pierre Hansen and others. But this is the story I wanted to get across. It's a really interesting one. There were two companies in the US doing computers. There was Eckhart Morkley Company, and there was ERA. And it turned out that when General Groves finished his term in doing the bomb and controlling, he seemed to be good at getting academics to do useful things. He joined Remington Rand to be in charge of the advanced research. And the first thing he did was buy the two companies in the US that were making computers. It so happened that the Morkley Company lost its contracts to build computers. Can you imagine? They lost it because they had communist engineers. Miracle of miracles. When Groves bought it, suddenly they got all their contracts. I put up there, all's fair in love and war. So Remington Rand accumulated those two companies that became UNIVAC. Now there was the Maniac machine. I won't spend a lot of time on that because most people kind of imagine this is the first machine, but it's really the same machine that was installed already in Princeton and elsewhere. So we have the story of Metropolis. But let's go on. IBM wasn't quiet. IBM was a business company, right? And so in the same era, and they knew everything because of von Neumann, they knew everything going on in the other companies. IBM had a 701 and a 704, and these were the early machines that really dominated the market, not the other ones. Don't have time to say much about. So IBM decided it would build a supercomputer, and it did. It was called the 7030, or the Stretch it was called. It was delivered to Los Alamos. It was the fastest machine in the world for a while, until the Control Data Corporation released its 6600 here. But it never met the performance goals. It was delivered. They used it for a few years, but it really wasn't that great. So then Seymour Cray, I mentioned he joined CDC, and he was designer of this 1604, designed the 3600 and the 6600. So one shout out I want to give, he was obsessed with industrial design, and I was able to find on the web an original designer of what this machine should look like. So he really believed that if you were going to try and convince somebody to spend millions of dollars on a computer, it better look beautiful. So this had to be covered with black glass, and you see this is from the 60s, and he succeeded. He built a beautiful machine. So what I wanted to do here is just point out to Michele, if you read carefully the 64 paper of Anise, he used both the CDC 3600 and the IBM 704. He used both of those. And they were pretty much equivalent. I'm going to go fast forward here. The 3600 was a machine I used in the early 70s at the Atomic Energy of Canada Research Labs. IBM did build a great machine, the 360. We had it in the lab where I was employed, and I used it when I visited IBM. But the best machine of that era was the 6600, designed by Seymour Cray. There was an interesting thing happened here, and a bit of nasty work here. So CEO of IBM made this quote. Last week, Control Data announced the 6600. In the lab developing this system, there were 34 people, including the janitor, 14 engineers, and 4 programmers. I failed to understand how we lost leadership position when we have hundreds and hundreds of people working. So they started a new project. They put 200 people in California to correct this situation. And there was a lawsuit because, as I said, all's fair in love and war. IBM announced a new Model 90, which didn't exist. And people knew it didn't exist, and there were lawsuits, and IBM had to pay CDC $600 million. So when you compete in the real world, it can get tough. So here, I want to show this because, again, Seymour Cray believed his machine should look beautiful. So this was finished with walnut and sapphire blue glass, just to make it look attractive, to persuade you that millions of dollars were well spent. So I used the IBM machines in 1970, don't have time for that. I used the UNIVAC I mentioned, don't have time for that. So Cray had this vision to build the ultimate supercomputer, but CDC wouldn't bankroll it. So he left and created Cray Research in 1972. He raised his own money, and he built the Cray 1. Announced it in 75, delivered in 76 to Los Alamos. Now, those of you that heard my talk after dinner would remember I said the 1970s were different. He worked all alone in designing this. It took a year to build the machine, actually assemble it. And here's a picture of him standing in front of the first Cray 1. You see the outfit he's wearing and see the colors of the machine. This, I need a couple more minutes, right? So here's the facts about this machine. So first of all, it was described as a $9 million love seat because of the thing around the bottom. It took a year to build 60 miles of wiring inside. That's why it took a long time to build. But it was the fastest machine in the world. Then there was a succession of other machines. I won't discuss them in detail, except to say, as Michele pointed out in his remarks yesterday, he said he was able to do his thing because Chineka had acquired an XMP. So this is incredible that they had, right? It's absolutely incredible. And so, and Chineka updated to the many processor Crays when they came out. But that was not designed by Seymour Cray, the last one. In my group, Michiel got to use the Cyber 205, which was a CDC machine. Don't have time. But a couple of pictures to just show you again how they like these machines to look beautiful. So this is the computer center at CERN with its Cray computers. So they look attractive, and there were others that were built. I don't have time to go into that, so I'll keep going. The last machine that actually he built and sold was called the 90. I think this was a poke in the eye for IBM that claimed they'd built a machine called the 90. And it wasn't very popular. It sold only 2 or 3 copies. And then he started another company to try and build the Cray 3. And that coincided with the end of the Cold War and no demand for supercomputers. The market disappeared. It went bankrupt. And he died in a car crash a year later. I couldn't see any indication that that was a suicide. A couple of quotes, and I'm going to stop. Read the left panel. When asked what design tools he used, Seymour Cray said he liked number 3 pencils and paper turned on the back, writing on the back so the lines were less visible. And then he was told, Apple just bought a Cray to help design the Mac. He replied, well, I just bought a Mac to design the Cray. So anyway, he was a remarkable man, incredibly influential, and I think that's pretty well the end for me. Huge newspaper headlines when he died. They just go on and on and on. The company continues. The one that he left to build the Cray 1 is still there, went to massively parallel. And Hewlett-Packard eventually became the owner of that. And this is my last slide. If you look at the list, the latest list of the top 500, the name Cray is on 4 of the top 5. And so Cray's name inextricably linked with supercomputers. And that's it, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's time for a short question, comment from the audience. I have one. I'm very curious what happens to the Germans, the first computer.
Yes, so the SUSE.
Yeah.
So the German computer was there, of course, unknown to US and UK, I mean, because it was done in the Nazi era. It was, in fact, a working machine. And the same mathematician that criticized Turing's work, Bernays, is the guy that brought the SUSE machine to EPFL in Switzerland in the 1950s. And I think it ran for about 10 years. The great thing about SUSE's machine was it was programmable. These other electromechanical were, yeah. So he developed his own language for the machine. Really a phenomenal person. I said I have lots of slides on that, but no time.
Thanks a lot. We thank Mike again for his nice talk. And we move to the next speaker.